Every crime leaves a trail. Every lie has an expiration date. This is the Reckoning Files. And this is what happened.
In January 2022, a jury in San Jose, California returned a verdict that sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley. The defendant sat at the table in silence. No tears. No visible reaction. Just the same composed expression she had worn for nearly 2 decades while building one of the most celebrated companies in American history. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. Her company, Theranos, had once been valued at $9 billion. She had been on the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and the New York Times Style magazine. She had convinced 2 former U.S. senators, a former Secretary of State, and some of the wealthiest investors in the country that she had cracked one of medicine's oldest problems. She had not. The technology was fake. The results were dangerous. And the people who trusted her, from Silicon Valley boardrooms to Walgreens clinics in Arizona, had been systematically deceived for over a decade. But to understand how one woman convinced the most sophisticated investors in the world to hand her $700 million for a machine that did not work, we need to go back to the beginning. To a 19-year-old girl at Stanford who told her professors she was dropping out to change the world. Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. She was, by every account, exceptionally driven from an early age. Her family had a history of public service and ambition. By the time she was a teenager, Holmes had one fixed idea in her mind: she was going to build something that mattered. She enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. Within her first year, she was already working in a research lab under Professor Channing Robertson, one of the most respected engineers at the university. He would later become one of her most vocal supporters, and eventually a member of the Theranos board. In 2003, at 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She had an idea. A big one. She wanted to build a device that could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood, taken from a fingertip. No needles. No labs. Fast, cheap, and available to anyone. The pitch was extraordinary. And in the right moment, at the right time, in the one place on Earth most likely to believe it, it worked. She founded Theranos in 2003 with the tuition money her parents had saved for her education. She was 19 years old. And she was already lying. Not about everything. Not yet. At first, the lies were small. Overconfident claims about what the technology could do. Timelines that were more optimistic than honest. The kind of exaggerations that ambitious founders make every day in Silicon Valley and usually get away with. But the technology itself, the actual device at the center of the entire company, never worked the way she claimed it did. And Holmes knew it. Here is what Theranos claimed it could do. A proprietary device called the Edison would take a few drops of blood from a finger prick, run it through a miniaturized analyzer, and produce results for hundreds of different tests in a matter of hours. Cheaper than conventional labs. Faster. More accessible. Potentially revolutionary for early disease detection. Here is what Theranos actually did: the Edison machine could only reliably run a small number of tests. For the vast majority of tests Theranos offered to patients, the company was secretly using commercially available analyzers made by other companies, including Siemens. The machines they were using were not designed for the small blood volumes Theranos was collecting. The results were frequently inaccurate. And according to testimony from former employees, the company knew this and continued operating anyway. One former employee testified that Theranos would regularly delete erroneous test results to make the machines appear more accurate than they were. Internal reports were falsified. Revenue projections shared with investors were fabricated. Holmes told investors Theranos would generate over $100 million in 2014. The actual figure was negligible. She also told investors that Theranos technology was being used to run blood tests for soldiers in Afghanistan. This was a lie. The US military had conducted limited pilot programs that went nowhere. There was no active deployment. But Holmes used the claim to give Theranos an air of national importance that made investors feel they were backing something larger than a startup. And then there were the board members. Holmes assembled one of the most impressive boards of directors in Silicon Valley history. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan. James Mattis, who would later become Secretary of Defense. Former U.S. Senators. Titans of media and finance. None of them had a background in medical technology. None of them were equipped to evaluate whether the science actually worked. And Holmes understood that. She chose them precisely because their names lent credibility, not because they could ask the right questions. By 2013, Theranos had struck a deal with Walgreens to place its testing service inside pharmacy locations across California and Arizona. Patients walked into Walgreens, gave a drop of blood, and received results that could determine whether they had HIV, diabetes, or dozens of other conditions. Results that were often wrong. One patient in Arizona received a false positive result for HIV. The distress that followed was real. The result was not. Theranos had run the test on equipment that was not designed for that level of accuracy with the blood volumes they were using. Real people were receiving false information about their health. And the company kept going. For over a decade, Holmes managed to keep the truth contained. Theranos was notoriously secretive. Employees signed aggressive non-disclosure agreements. Those who raised concerns internally were, according to multiple former employees, marginalized or fired. The culture was one of fear and silence. But in 2015, a journalist named John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal started asking questions. Carreyrou had received a tip from a source inside the company. He spent months tracking down former employees, scientists, and industry experts. What he found was damning. The technology did not work as advertised. The company was using third-party machines for most of its tests. The results being given to patients were unreliable. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the investigation. Holmes went on CNBC the same day and called the story false and misleading. She was composed, persuasive, certain. The kind of certainty that had made investors believe her for years. This time, it did not work. Regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services opened an inspection of Theranos laboratory in Newark, California. What they found was a facility operating so far below federal standards that in 2016 they banned Holmes herself from owning or operating a medical laboratory for 2 years and threatened to revoke Theranos laboratory certification entirely. Walgreens terminated its relationship with Theranos. Safeway, which had also signed a deal with the company, followed. The partnerships that had given Theranos its commercial credibility collapsed within months. By September 2018, Theranos was dissolved. $9 billion in valuation. Gone. The Edison device that was supposed to change medicine had never worked as promised. The investors had lost hundreds of millions. The patients had been given results they could not trust. And Holmes was still insisting it was not her fault. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth Holmes and former Theranos president Ramesh Sunny Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Holmes stepped down as CEO but maintained her innocence. The trial began in August 2021 and lasted 15 weeks. Dozens of witnesses took the stand. Former employees described a company built on intimidation and deception. Investors described being shown falsified financial documents and misleading technology demonstrations. Patients described receiving test results that led to unnecessary medical procedures and psychological distress. Holmes testified on her own behalf for 7 days. She claimed she had been misled by her own team about the technology. She alleged that Balwani, who was also her romantic partner during much of the company's history, had exerted psychological control over her. It was a defense strategy that divided observers and appeared to shift responsibility in every direction but toward herself. On January 3, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud, including conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud involving individual investors. The amounts defrauded in those specific counts exceeded $140 million. She was acquitted on the counts related to defrauding patients. The jury could not reach agreement on 3 additional investor counts. On November 18, 2022, United States District Judge Edward Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She was ordered to report to the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, and began serving her sentence on May 30, 2023. Holmes and Balwani, who was convicted on all 12 counts and sentenced to nearly 13 years, were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to the victims of the fraud. Among those victims were Rupert Murdoch, who lost $125 million, and members of the Walton family, founders of Walmart. The trail had always been there. The falsified reports. The doctored presentations. The machine that did not work. For 12 years, Elizabeth Holmes had asked the world to trust her, and the world did. Until it could not anymore. The collapse of Theranos left more than financial damage. It exposed something deeper about the culture that had allowed it to happen. Silicon Valley's tolerance for bold vision, for founders who promised to change the world before the product is built, had created the conditions in which someone like Holmes could thrive for over a decade. Investors with the resources to conduct due diligence had not. Journalists who covered her rise had celebrated without questioning. A board stacked with credentialed names had provided legitimacy without accountability. And in clinics in California and Arizona, real people had made medical decisions based on results that were not reliable. The Theranos case did not just end one woman's career, it became the lens through which Silicon Valley began, however slowly, to ask harder questions about the stories it chose to believe. That is the file on Elizabeth Holmes. The trail was always there. It always is. If you want the next case, you know where to find it. This is The Reckoning Files.